Thomas Renner was fired on a Tuesday morning in front of 41 people for being 53 minutes late. The woman who fired him, Diane Colwell, director of operations at Halverson Precision Group, did not call him into her office. She did not lower her voice. She walked onto the production floor at 7:53 a.m., found him at his station pulling off his jacket, and said, loudly enough that the grinding machines had to be shut down for people to hear clearly, that she would not tolerate this kind of disrespect from any employee, regardless of tenure, regardless of title, regardless of what anyone thought they were owed after years of service. Thomas did not argue. He set his jacket on the bench, looked at her for a moment, and then looked at the floor. He did not explain himself. He did not say where he had been. He picked up his jacket again and walked out. The floor stayed quiet for almost a full minute after the door closed behind him. Then Diane Colwell straightened the folder she was holding, said that work would resume immediately, and left the way she came. Nobody said anything, but almost everyone looked at the door. Thomas Renner had worked at Halverson for 11 years. He was 44 years old, a master-level diagnostic technician with a specialization in high-performance hydraulic systems, and he was, by any honest measure, the most reliable person in that building. His supervisor, a quiet man named Frank Osei, had written in 3 consecutive annual reviews that Thomas was the kind of employee a company spent decades trying to find and almost never did. Methodical, patient. The kind of man who caught the problem before the problem became a failure. He was also a widower. His wife, Joanna, had died of an aneurysm 4 years earlier in the spring on a Saturday morning while Thomas was making pancakes for their daughter. Cora was 6 at the time. She was 10 now, and she remembered her mother mostly through photographs and the particular way Thomas kept the kitchen. The same spice rack Joanna had arranged, the same dish towel colors, the same brand of dish soap, because Cora had once said it smelled like when Mom did the dishes, and Thomas had never bought a different kind since. He had no family nearby. His sister lived in Portland. His in-laws were in their 70s and in declining health. The network of support he had built for Cora was narrow and carefully maintained. A neighbor named Mrs. Tully, who watched Cora on late nights, a school carpool with 2 other parents, and a college student named Bria, who picked Cora up on Tuesdays and Thursdays. Bria had texted at 5:47 Monday evening to say she had mono and couldn't come. That was the beginning of it. The Monday night in question had started normally enough. Thomas had clocked out at 5:30, driven to Cora's school, picked her up, made dinner. Cora had homework. He helped her with the long division she kept getting wrong, not because she didn't understand it, but because she rushed, and rushing was a habit Thomas was trying, gently, to undo in her. At 8:14 p.m., his work phone rang. It was the overnight line, which almost never rang, which meant something had gone wrong. The caller was a man named Jerome, one of the junior techs, who explained in a voice that was trying very hard to stay calm that the Callaway hydraulic test bench, the one Halverson had spent 8 months calibrating for a Department of Defense contract evaluation, scheduled for Wednesday morning, was throwing pressure anomalies that nobody on the overnight crew could diagnose. Jerome had called Frank Osei first. Frank was in Raleigh for a family thing. Frank had given Jerome Thomas's number and said simply call him. Thomas was quiet for a moment. Then he asked Jerome to describe the anomaly. Jerome described it. Thomas was quiet again. Then he said he'd be there in 40 minutes. He called Mrs. Tully. Mrs. Tully's husband had had a fall that afternoon, and she was at urgent care. She was sorry. She really was sorry. He called the 2 carpool parents. One didn't answer. One answered and said, of course, bring Cora over, no problem at all. Thomas drove Cora to the Hendersons' house, got her settled with her backpack and her book, and her specific stuffed rabbit, whose name was Carrot, and explained to Linda Henderson that he didn't know when he'd be back, but he would call when he was on his way. He arrived at Halverson at 9:22 p.m. The Callaway bench was a hydraulic simulation system that replicated the load conditions of heavy equipment under field stress. It was not complicated in theory. It was extremely complicated in practice. The calibration had taken a team of 4 people 8 months, partly because the tolerances were aerospace grade, and partly because one of the subassemblies used a proprietary pressure valve from a German supplier that had a known sensitivity to temperature variance during initial cycling. Thomas had flagged that valve 14 months ago in a written note that had been acknowledged and filed. When he pulled the diagnostic panel at 9:47 p.m., he found what he expected to find, and also what he did not expect. The pressure anomaly was, as he had suspected, a cycling issue with the German valve. It had been installed 3 degrees off axis, a margin small enough that it had passed inspection and significant enough that it was now causing microcavitation in the hydraulic fluid under load. That was fixable. What he did not expect was a secondary problem, deeper in the system. Someone had run a test sequence 3 weeks earlier that had been logged under a general maintenance entry, rather than a specific test record. The sequence had introduced a thermal load the bench wasn't rated for at that calibration stage. The result was a hairline fracture in one of the internal manifold blocks. Not visible to the naked eye, not detectable by standard inspection, but present, and under Wednesday's DoD test conditions, almost certainly catastrophic. Thomas sat with that for a while. He took photographs. He documented everything. He wrote up the sequence of events as he understood them, noting the dates, the log entry, the discrepancy between the test that had been run and the test that had been recorded. Then he got to work. He couldn't fix the manifold block. That required a replacement part and a recalibration process that took days. But he could document the fracture in a way that would be undeniable, present the evidence clearly enough that Wednesday's test would be postponed rather than conducted on compromised equipment, and prevent a failure in front of a Department of Defense evaluation team that would have cost Halverson the contract and possibly much more. He worked until 4:30 in the morning. At 4:30, he tried to submit his diagnostic report through the internal documentation system. His credentials returned an access error. It was the kind of error that appeared when an employee's system permissions had been modified. Not a technical glitch, but an administrative action. He stared at the screen for a moment, then took a photograph of the error message with his personal phone, wrote the full report longhand in the shift log book that sat on the bench station desk, signed it, dated it, noted the time, and left it where it would be found. He texted Jerome, "Report is in the physical log. Read it before anyone touches the bench." Jerome responded at 4:48 a.m. "Okay." Thomas drove to the Hendersons. Linda had set up the pull-out couch. Cora was asleep with Carrot tucked under her arm. Thomas sat in the chair across from her for a few minutes before he drove home, showered and changed. He was on the road by 7:20. Cora's school didn't open until 7:45. He waited in the car line, signed her in, and drove to Halverson. He arrived at 7:53 a.m. Diane Colwell had been director of operations for 14 months. She had come from a logistics firm in Cincinnati, brought in by the new ownership group that had acquired Halverson 2 years prior as part of a portfolio consolidation. She was organized, data-driven, and had a genuine talent for process improvement. She also had almost no background in precision manufacturing and a management philosophy that valued visible accountability over contextual judgment. She had a policy of punctuality. It was written. It had been distributed. It applied to everyone. When she saw Thomas walk in at 7:53, she did not ask why he was late. She had asked that question twice before with other employees and had felt, both times, that the asking had undermined the policy. The policy was not about reasons. The policy was about the time on the clock. She handled it the way she always handled it, which was directly and in view of the floor, because she believed that inconsistency was more damaging to a culture than harshness. She did not know that Thomas had been in the building until 4:30 that morning. She did not know about the manifold fracture. She did not know about the DoD evaluation. She did not know about Cora. She fired him and went back to her office and had her 8 a.m. call. Frank Ossie landed at Charlotte Douglas International Airport at 9:15 a.m. He had his phone off for the flight. When he turned it on and saw what was in his messages, he sat in his seat until the plane was almost empty. He had 7 messages from Jerome, 2 from Thomas, 1 from Linda Henderson, who had gotten his number from Thomas's emergency contact form and didn't know who else to call. He read them in order. Then he read Jerome's messages again. Then he stood up, got his bag from the overhead compartment, and called Diane Colwell from the jetway. She answered on the second ring. Frank was not a man who raised his voice. He had managed people for 19 years, and he had found, consistently, that the quieter he spoke during a serious conversation, the more clearly he was heard. He told Diane, in a voice that was extremely quiet, what Thomas Renner had done the night before. He told her about the manifold fracture. He told her about the log entry that didn't match the test that had been run. He told her about the access error that had prevented Thomas from submitting his report through the system, and that the access error had occurred because someone had administratively revoked Thomas's system credentials at 11:43 p.m. Monday night, while Thomas was in the building working. Diane was quiet for a moment. Frank said, "The DD team arrives at 8 Wednesday morning. If Thomas hadn't caught that fracture and documented it the way he did, we would have run a compromise test on a $2.4 million contract. The bench would have failed under load." On camera, in front of federal evaluators, Diane said, "Who revoked his credentials?" Frank said he didn't know yet, but he intended to find out. The credentials had been revoked by someone using the account of a mid-level systems administrator named Kevin Stroud. Kevin Stroud had left the building at 6 p.m. Monday and had not returned. His access card logs confirmed it. His account, however, had been accessed remotely at 11:43 p.m. from an IP address registered to a device on Halverson's internal network. The device was a laptop assigned to the Project Coordination Office. The Project Coordination Office had 2 occupants. One was out on medical leave. The other was a man named Curtis Adler, who had joined Halverson 10 months ago as a vendor relationship manager, and who had, Frank would later learn, been in quiet communication with a competing firm that had submitted a bid on the same DoD contract Halverson was being evaluated for. Curtis Adler had known about the manifold fracture. He had been copied on the original calibration documents. He had understood, at some level, what a failed evaluation would mean for Halverson's position, and what it would mean for the competing firm's chances. He had not caused the fracture, but when he learned, through the kind of hallway knowledge that circulates in small facilities, that Thomas was in the building working on the bench, he had made a calculation. He had revoked Thomas's credentials. He had hoped, apparently, that the report wouldn't get written, that the fracture would stay undocumented, that Wednesday would go the way it would go. He had not counted on the shift logbook. He had not counted on Thomas Renner being the kind of man who would write everything down by hand, sign it, date it, and leave it where it would be found. Frank called Thomas at noon. Thomas was home. He had picked Cora up from school at the regular time, made her lunch, and was sitting at the kitchen table with his hands around a coffee mug that had gone cold. Cora was reading in the other room. He could hear the particular silence of a child who is very focused on a book. Frank told him everything. He told him about the fracture report, about the credentials, about Curtis Adler. He told him that the IT audit had taken approximately 4 hours and that Curtis Adler had been escorted from the building 40 minutes ago. He told him that the DoD evaluation was being postponed, that the manifold block was being replaced, and that the written documentation Thomas had left in the shift log had been photographed, scanned, and submitted to the evaluation team as evidence of the facility's self-correction protocols. The evaluation team, Frank said, had Responsively, a company that catches its own problems, documents them completely, and corrects them before a federal evaluation is a company that knows what it's doing. There was a silence. Thomas said, "Okay." Frank said, "I'm calling because Diane wants to speak with you, and because I wanted to call you first." Thomas said he understood. Frank said, "I'm sorry this happened, Thomas. I should have had a backup plan for my being out of town. That's on me." Thomas didn't say anything for a moment. Then he said, "How's your family?" Frank paused. Then he said his father was doing a little better. "Thank you for asking." Diane Colwell had spent the 4 hours between Frank's call and her conversation with Thomas doing something she did not do, naturally or comfortably, which was sitting with the full weight of what she had done. She was not a person who avoided accountability. That was something she genuinely believed about herself, and the past 4 hours had tested that belief in a way she hadn't anticipated. It was one thing to hold a policy. It was another to hold a policy and learn, afterward, that the person you had made an example of had been in the building until 4:30 in the morning, preventing a disaster that would have ended the company's most significant federal contract. It was another thing still to learn that his credentials had been revoked by someone working against the company. While he was still in the building, while he was still trying to do his job, and that he had responded to that obstacle by picking up a pen and writing everything down by hand. She had read the shift log entry. Jerome had photographed it and sent it to Frank, who had forwarded it to her. The handwriting was careful. The documentation was complete. The timestamp was 4:22 a.m. At the bottom, in the same careful handwriting, Thomas had written, "Left physical copy here as system access was unavailable. Full diagnostic photographs on personal device, available on request. T. Renner." Diane sat with that sentence for a long time. Then she called him. She did not open with an explanation of the circumstances. She had thought about how to begin this call for 2 hours, and she had decided that anything that sounded like she was building a context for the apology, before the apology, was a way of making herself the subject of the conversation. She didn't want to be the subject of this conversation. She said, "Mr. Renner, this is Diane Colwell. I owe you an apology, and I'm going to give you one without any conditions attached to it." Thomas didn't say anything. She said, "What I did this morning was wrong. I acted on a policy without asking a question I should have asked, and I did it in front of your colleagues, and that was wrong. I'm sorry." There was a silence. Thomas said, "I appreciate that," she said. "I'd like to offer you your position back, with full back pay for today, and I'd like to discuss with you whether there are other things we should be doing differently." There was another silence. Longer this time. Thomas said, "Can I have a day to think about it?" Diane said yes, of course, take whatever time you need. After she hung up, she sat at her desk for a while. She thought about the 41 people on the production floor that morning. She thought about the fact that not one of them had looked at her when she walked back through. She thought about the shift log entry. She thought about 4:22 a.m. and a man writing everything down by hand because someone had locked him out of the system and still getting it right. Thomas thought about it that evening after Cora was in bed. He sat at the kitchen table, which was where he did most of his serious thinking, and he thought about 11 years. He thought about what it had felt like to walk out of that building with his jacket over his arm, while 41 people watched. He thought about what Frank had said, and what Diane had said, and the silence on the production floor after the door had closed. He thought about the manifold block, and the shift log, and the particular quality of the early morning hours in a facility when you are the only person working, and you know that what you're doing matters, and no one is watching, and you do it anyway. He had not done it for Diane Colwell. He had not done it for Halverson Precision Group, or for the Department of Defense, or for the contract. He had done it because it was his work, and because the work had to be right, and because there was a test scheduled on Wednesday, and the bench was compromised, and if no one caught it, no one would catch it. He thought about Cora asleep in the next room. He had not told her what had happened. She knew he'd come home early. She had looked at him in the careful way she sometimes looked at him when she was trying to read a situation she didn't fully understand, and he had said he had the day off, and did she want to go to the park? And she had said yes, and they had gone to the park. He called Frank that night. not Diane. He told Frank he would come back, but that he wanted one thing understood clearly. He would not work in an environment where a written policy was a substitute for a conversation. He had worked at Halverson for 11 years. He had never been late without a reason. He was not asking for special treatment. He was asking to be spoken to like a person. Frank said he understood. He said he would make sure Diane understood. Thomas said that was enough for him. He returned to work on Thursday. He came in at 7:15 and went directly to his station and started his shift. No announcement was made. Nobody said anything about Monday or Tuesday. The grinding machines ran. The morning moved forward the way mornings do. At 9 a.m., Diane Colwell came down to the production floor. She did not gather everyone. She walked directly to Thomas's station and waited until he looked up. Then she said, in a voice that carried but was not performed, that she wanted to say something in front of the people who had been there Monday, because they had been there Monday, and they deserved to hear it too. She said she had made a mistake. She had acted without asking a question she should have asked, and she had done it publicly, and she was correcting that publicly now. She said, Thomas Renner had spent Monday night in this building, working to protect a contract that every person on this floor depended on, and that he was back because he belonged here, and she was glad he came back. She said it plainly, without embellishment. Then she nodded at Thomas and walked back toward her office. The floor was not silent this time. Someone started clapping. Thomas didn't see who it was. It didn't matter. He looked back at the bench in front of him and turned the calibration wrench in his hand and felt something he didn't have a word for settle somewhere in his chest. The DoD evaluation was rescheduled for the following Wednesday. The replacement manifold block arrived Friday afternoon. Thomas led the recalibration, which took 3 days and went exactly as it should. Frank flew back Tuesday night and was on the floor at 6 a.m. Wednesday, 2 hours before the evaluation team arrived. The test ran clean. The contract was awarded to Halverson Precision Group 11 days later. The internal audit findings regarding Curtis Adler were referred to the company's legal team and, eventually, to law enforcement. That process would take months, and Thomas largely stopped following it. He had given his statement, he had provided his documentation. The rest was not his work to do. In the spring, about 4 months later, Cora made Thomas a card for his birthday. She had folded a piece of construction paper in half and drawn on the front a picture of a man at a workbench, which was how she thought of him, which was accurate. Inside, in her handwriting, still slightly crooked, still rushing a little, still his daughter's handwriting, she had written, "You always do it right, even when nobody's watching. That's my favorite thing about you." He put the card on the refrigerator. It stayed there. He didn't explain to her what had happened at work that winter, or not all of it. She was 10. There would be time for the longer version of things when she was older and could hold more of it. What he told her, when she asked why the card seemed to mean so much to him, was that sometimes you do the right thing in an empty room at 4 in the morning and it still counts. That the counting happens whether or not anyone sees it. She thought about that for a moment. Then she said, "Like when I clean under my bed even if you don't check." He laughed. He hadn't laughed that way in a while. It surprised him a little. He said, "Exactly like that."